When I got married, I didn't tell my husband or my mother-in-law that the house we lived in was mine. And I'm glad I didn't, because right after the wedding, my mother-in-law, along with my husband, Emily, had always been cautious with her heart and with her money. At 34 years old, she had carved out a quiet, independent life for herself in Denver. She taught literature at a local high school, adored her morning coffee rituals, and took pride in a cozy house she bought entirely on her own after nearly a decade of saving, budgeting, and working late tutoring gigs. The house was a modest 2-story bungalow with ivy crawling up the front porch, hardwood floors that creaked like old friends, and a garden Emily had tended lovingly every spring. It wasn't extravagant, but it was hers. When she met Ryan, she hadn't expected to fall in love so quickly. He was charming in a boyish way, with a quiet laugh and kind eyes. Their relationship moved fast, and within a year, they were engaged. Ryan had just gone through a career shift and was temporarily staying in an apartment with roommates. When marriage entered the picture, the most logical next step seemed to be for him to move into Emily's home. But Emily never said the house was hers. Not explicitly. When they discussed logistics, she phrased things delicately. You can move into the house, not my house. She didn't correct him when he referred to it as our place. And she didn't clarify when he once mentioned how lucky we are that my new job means we don't need a mortgage. In truth, Emily had paid off the mortgage 3 years earlier. She had the deed and every receipt tucked away in a locked filing cabinet upstairs. Still, she chose silence over transparency, not out of malice, but out of instinct. That instinct, quiet but firm, whispered to her that something was off. Ryan had never shown interest in the house itself, never asked how she had managed to buy it, never talked about helping with expenses. But more than that, there was a lingering unease when he spoke about his mother, Margaret. Emily had only met her a few times before the wedding, and each meeting had left Emily rattled. Margaret was cordial in public, but always carried a hint of superiority in her tone when she spoke to Emily. Her eyes scanned the home with what felt like quiet judgment, and once, over dinner, she had asked if Emily had considered moving somewhere more fitting for a family. Margaret, like Ryan, had assumed the house was his. She often referred to it as Ryan's place, and when Emily had gently corrected her once, Margaret had simply smiled and replied, "Oh, honey, I know how these things work." It was subtle, but Emily noticed. The tiny shifts in tone, the possessive language, the way Margaret acted like she already had a claim to something that wasn't hers. So Emily made a choice. She didn't correct them again. She didn't offer up details. She let them think what they wanted. She signed no new documents, made no title changes, and spoke to no one about the truth, not even her closest friends. The house remained legally and financially hers, locked under her name alone, untouched by marriage or family. On the surface, everything seemed calm. The wedding was small but beautiful, and Ryan moved in without issue. He brought little with him, just clothes, a few books, and some kitchen gadgets he was oddly attached to. The transition was smooth, and Emily allowed herself to relax, if only slightly. She hadn't told him the truth, but she figured she might one day, when the time felt right. But the time never came. Not when they unpacked his things, not when they started rearranging the guest room, and not even when Margaret began visiting more frequently. Every time Emily thought about telling him, something held her back. A flicker of doubt, a gut feeling, a memory of Margaret's condescending smile. So she said nothing. It wasn't guilt that weighed on her. It was vigilance. She had built this life on her own. The walls, the roof, the garden with its overgrown lavender and sunflowers taller than her. None of it had come easy. She remembered eating canned soup for weeks to save a little extra. She remembered skipping vacations, ignoring sales, and staying home while friends traveled. Also, she could have something of her own. Something no one could take away. Now, as she lay beside Ryan one quiet night, listening to the soft hum of crickets outside, she stared at the ceiling and thought about what she hadn't said. Her secret wasn't just a technicality. It was a line in the sand. And though Ryan didn't know it, Emily had drawn that line for a reason. She had no idea just how soon that line would be tested. The first sign that something was wrong came on a cloudy Tuesday afternoon. Emily had just returned from work. still dressed in her classroom attire, with a stack of ungraded essays in her bag, and her mind half distracted by a particularly stubborn student who refused to read Pride and Prejudice. As she unlocked the front door, she heard voices inside, louder than usual. She paused, the key still in the lock, then pushed the door open slowly. Inside, Ryan was standing in the living room, looking helpless. Next to him stood Margaret, holding 2 large suitcases, a rolling duffel bag, and a tote bag slung over her shoulder. Emily blinked. Margaret, dressed in a navy coat and pale scarf, gave her a stiff smile. "Oh, good," she said, walking toward Emily without a trace of hesitation. "You're home. I was just telling Ryan that I'll be staying here for a while, just until I get things sorted out." Emily stood frozen in the doorway. "Excuse me?" Margaret breezed past her into the hallway, already eyeing the guest room door. "My lease ended earlier than expected. Nothing to worry about, of course. I didn't want to trouble you with the details. Ryan and I discussed it. He said it would be fine." Emily turned to Ryan, who wouldn't meet her eyes. His shoulders were slightly hunched, his hands deep in his pockets. "You what?" she asked him directly. Ryan cleared his throat. Mom's place had some issues, and she didn't want to sign a new lease until she figured out her next move. I didn't think it would be a big deal. It's just temporary. Emily stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind her with more force than necessary. "How temporary?" "A few weeks, maybe a month," Margaret interjected as she opened the guest room door and peered inside, inspecting the space like a realtor showing a home. "Just until I find a new apartment. Or maybe a condo. Something more appropriate." Emily remained still, her thoughts racing. She had just walked into her own home to find her mother-in-law declaring an indefinite stay, and her husband apparently complicit. The ease with which Margaret made herself comfortable was unsettling. Over the next few days, Margaret settled in with disturbing efficiency. She unpacked her bags into the guest room's closet and drawers, filled the bathroom with her personal products, and began making small comments about routines and arrangements. By the end of the week, she was cooking dinner unprompted and using words like "our routine" and "the way we do things around here." Ryan, for his part, became increasingly evasive. He seemed caught between his mother's strong presence and Emily's simmering silence. Whenever Emily brought up the subject carefully, without confrontation, he would brush it off, say it was only temporary, that his mother just needed a little stability, that it would be more trouble to say no than to just let her stay. But Emily wasn't fooled. Margaret wasn't behaving like someone crashing temporarily out of necessity. She was behaving like someone who had moved in and expected to stay. It began with small things. Margaret started rearranging the kitchen, claiming it would be more efficient to keep the pots closer to the stove. She moved Emily's spice rack, reorganized the pantry, and even replaced a few utensils she didn't like. Then came the living room. She shifted the sofa to a different angle, moved the armchair to what she called a more social position, and brought in a throw blanket that clashed with everything Emily had decorated with. When Emily came home one afternoon to find her books, her carefully curated collection of novels and poetry, reordered by size instead of genre or author, she nearly screamed. She confronted Ryan that evening. She's redecorating. Emily said as they stood in the kitchen, "This isn't temporary. She's moving in." Ryan looked away. "It's just how she is. She's trying to help." She threw out my turmeric because she didn't like the smell. Ryan winced. "I'll talk to her." But he didn't. Not really. He made vague suggestions, hinted that Emily was particular about her space, and quickly changed the subject whenever real tension arose. It became clear to Emily that Margaret had no intention of leaving, and that Ryan lacked the will to make her. Then came a night that tipped everything further. Emily came home from a parent-teacher conference late in the evening, exhausted. She dropped her bag on the table, kicked off her shoes, and headed upstairs to take a long shower. But as she passed the guest room, she noticed the door open. Margaret wasn't inside. She paused at the door to her and Ryan's bedroom. It was shut. Quietly, she turned the knob and peeked in. There, lying on their bed, was Margaret, watching television on Ryan's tablet, propped up against Emily's pillows. Emily's voice was calm but cold. "Why are you in our room?" Margaret looked up with surprise that didn't seem genuine. "Oh, I didn't realize you were home. Ryan said I could rest in here. The guest bed's too firm for my back." Emily stood still, her jaw clenched. "This is our bedroom. I'm not sleeping here, darling. Just resting. The guest room needs a better mattress. I was thinking we could look into it this weekend." That night, Emily lay awake beside Ryan, neither of them speaking. She didn't ask why he'd allowed his mother into their room. She didn't want to hear another excuse. The following morning, she rose early, before Margaret was awake, before Ryan had even stirred. She pulled the deed to the house from the filing cabinet and placed it in a manila envelope. She wasn't sure what she would do with it yet, but for the first time since her wedding, she realized the truth might need to come out. Margaret had crossed the line, not just with the kitchen or the bookshelves or the bathroom drawers, but with her assumption that she could simply insert herself into their lives, their space, their home, as though she had a right to be there. Emily didn't know what Margaret's endgame was, but she was beginning to suspect that this temporary stay had been planned long before her bags showed up at the door, and she would be ready. It started with the thermostat. One morning, Emily noticed the temperature in the house had been set to 78 degrees. She turned it down to 72 without thinking much of it. The next evening, it was back to 78, then 79, then 80. Each time she adjusted it, it would somehow find its way back. At first, she assumed it was a glitch or Ryan's doing, but one afternoon she came home early and saw Margaret standing on a chair in the hallway, fiddling with the unit. "I like it warmer," Margaret said as she stepped down. "You wouldn't want me catching a chill, would you?" It was said with a smile, but the implication lingered. Margaret wasn't asking. She was declaring. Emily didn't respond. She walked past her, dropped her bag on the dining table, and took a deep breath. The temperature wasn't the only thing Margaret had decided to claim. Over the next several days, she began implementing small but infuriating rules around the house. Shoes must be removed at the door, not a problem in itself, but it came with lectures about bringing outside filth onto her clean floors. No food upstairs. No television after 9 unless headphones were used. Dishes must be washed immediately, not left in the sink, even for 10 minutes. Every rule was delivered with the tone of a benevolent dictator, always masked as concern or habit, but they weren't suggestions. They were mandates. Ryan, as usual, offered little resistance. "She's just trying to help keep things tidy," he said when Emily confronted him one night. "She's used to her own routines." Emily narrowed her eyes. "This isn't a routine. It's a takeover." Ryan rubbed his temples and avoided her gaze. "Can we just try to keep the peace for now? It's temporary." Emily didn't answer. That word, temporary, was beginning to feel like a joke. It wasn't just about control over objects or schedules. It was about presence. Margaret was always there. She followed Emily into the kitchen in the morning, hovered nearby while she cooked, and inserted herself into phone conversations by asking loudly from the next room, "Who are you talking to, dear?" She accidentally walked into the bathroom when the door wasn't locked. She commented on Emily's clothing choices. "That sweater washes you out, sweetheart," and tooted at the amount of wine she poured at dinner. At first, Emily tried to counterbalance it with patience. She reminded herself that she was an adult, that she had boundaries, that Margaret's presence would eventually become unbearable to Ryan too. But that moment never came. Instead, Ryan began to adapt. He started saying things like, "Mom thinks we should reorganize the pantry," or "Mom mentioned we could use a shoe rack at the door." He stopped defending their decisions as a couple. He started referring to Margaret's ideas as improvements. One evening, Emily came home and found a man in the kitchen installing a new faucet. "I'm from Boulder Plumbing," he said with a friendly nod. "Here to put in that touchless model. Mrs. Preston said she wanted it installed today." Emily blinked. "Mrs. Preston?" He pointed to the living room, where Margaret was chatting on the phone, sipping tea. "That's her there, right?" Emily didn't respond. She waited until the faucet was installed, thanked the plumber, and then walked into the living room. "Why did you order a new faucet?" she asked calmly. Margaret looked up. "Oh, you're going to love it. It's so much more sanitary. No more greasy fingerprints. I figured you wouldn't mind. You didn't ask. Well, Margaret said with a small shrug, sometimes it's just easier to do things. I didn't want to burden you with another decision. You work so hard. Emily stared at her. You don't make decisions about this house. Margaret tilted her head, her voice sugary and sharp. It's our house now, isn't it? Or at least Ryan's and yours. And I'm family. I just want to help. Emily turned and walked away before she said something she couldn't take back. Upstairs, she sat on the edge of her bed and gripped the edge of the mattress. The words echoed in her head, our house, and she knew exactly what Margaret believed, that she belonged here, that she had a say, that she had a claim. 2 days later, the guest room furniture was changed out. Margaret had sold the bed and dresser on a local app and replaced them with a queen-size set she had delivered without telling anyone. She supervised the movers herself. When Emily walked in, the room looked completely different. It was too cramped, Margaret explained. This is much better for when I'm here. And of course, when you two have guests in the future, it will be more comfortable. Emily was stunned. You sold our furniture without asking. Margaret blinked. I thought it was junk. It wasn't yours to decide. I'm only trying to contribute, dear. I didn't think you'd be so emotional about old furniture. Later that evening, Emily brought up to Ryan. He looked tired, as if the confrontation exhausted him before it even began. She should have asked, he said, but his tone lacked conviction. She sold things I bought with my money in a house that she doesn't own. You don't think that's a problem? She meant well. Maybe just let her feel useful. She's lonely, Em. She's been through a lot. Emily stared at him, suddenly struck by how distant he seemed. Not just in words, but in presence. Like he had slowly drifted into a version of himself that she didn't recognize. A quieter, more passive man who smiled politely at boundaries as they were erased one by one. She realized something then. This wasn't just about Margaret's behavior. It was about Ryan's silence. And silence, she now understood, could be louder than any command. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when the tipping point arrived. The kind of stillness that, on any other day, would have brought Emily comfort. A moment to read by the window, sip tea, maybe work in the garden. But something fell off from the moment she stepped into the house after running errands. The air was different, too still, too silent. She called out, "Ryan?" No answer. Margaret. Nothing. Emily walked to the hallway and noticed the guest room door was slightly ajar. Inside, the room had been completely reorganized again. Margaret's things were now in Emily's antique chest, the one she had inherited from her grandmother and had moved to the guest room months ago to protect from damage. But that wasn't the worst part. When she opened it, half the contents were gone. Panic flickered through her. She moved quickly to the closet, where she had kept boxes of letters, old photographs, and a few childhood journals. One of the boxes was missing entirely. She checked the hall closet, then under the bed, then the basement. Gone. She found Margaret in the backyard, standing under the oak tree and talking on the phone with someone, her voice low and pleasant. Emily waited for her to hang up. When Margaret turned around, she smiled as if nothing had happened. "I need to ask you something," Emily said, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Did you throw anything away from the guest room closet?" Margaret tilted her head, her smile not fading. "Oh, I did a little organizing. Some things look like old junk, just boxes of old paper. I figured you wouldn't miss it." Emily stared at her, unable to speak at first. "You threw away my journals, my letters, things I've kept since I was a teenager." Margaret blinked. "Were they important?" "You had no right," Emily said, her voice rising. "You went through my personal things. You opened drawers and threw away things that had nothing to do with you." "I was cleaning," Margaret said, her tone still calm. "If you wanted to keep them, maybe you shouldn't have left them in a shared space." "It's not a shared space," Emily snapped. "This is my home. You're a guest." Something shifted then. Margaret's expression hardened. Just for a moment, the charm dropped, like a mask slipping out of place. Don't be melodramatic, she said. I've lived here for weeks. I help with the chores. I pay for groceries. I cook most nights. That's not a guest. That's family. Emily took a step forward. You are not family to me. Not when you violate my privacy. Not when you disrespect my space and my memories. Before Margaret could respond, Ryan appeared at the patio door, drawn by the raised voices. He stepped outside, cautiously, looking between them. What's going on? He asked. Emily turned to him, her voice trembling with restrained anger. Your mother threw away personal things from the guest room. Journals, letters, things I've kept for years. Ryan glanced at Margaret, who looked innocently back at him. I didn't know they were important, she said. They were dusty. I didn't mean any harm. Emily's jaw tightened. She went through my things without asking. Ryan held up a hand, trying to be the peacemaker. Can we just... Everyone calm down for a second? Emily felt something inside her break. You always say that. Calm down. It's not a big deal. But this is a big deal. She keeps crossing lines, and you keep letting it happen. Margaret stepped in. I didn't mean to upset anyone. But maybe if there were clearer expectations about what's okay and what isn't, this could have been avoided. Emily's head snapped toward her. I shouldn't have to post a list of rules on every wall. You are not entitled to go through my belongings. Period. Ryan rubbed his face. Please, both of you. This isn't how I imagined things going after the wedding. Can we just talk this through like adults? Emily stared at him. Then act like an adult. Take a side. Say something real. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Ryan had said in days. Margaret, undeterred, placed a hand on Ryan's arm. Sweetheart, maybe it's best if I take a walk. Give you to a moment. She left without waiting for approval, gliding to the garden path as if nothing had happened. Emily turned to Ryan. How much more are you going to let her do? Rearranging furniture is one thing. Redecorating is another. But now she's destroying things that mattered to me. Ryan looked exhausted. I didn't know she was doing that. I didn't think. That's the problem, Emily said. You're not thinking. You're avoiding. And I'm the one who's paying for it. Ryan sat down heavily on the patio bench. She's my mom. She doesn't have anywhere else to go right now. That's not true, Emily said. She's here because she wants control, and you're giving it to her. He didn't respond. Emily walked back inside. Upstairs, she stood in front of the now half-empty chest and stared at the space where her things had been. The silence was suffocating. She picked up the manila envelope where she had stored the deed and held it in her hands. She hadn't wanted it to come to this. She had hoped naively that the situation would fix itself, that Margaret would leave on her own, that Ryan would stand up. But none of those things had happened. Now she understood. Margaret wasn't just a guest overstaying her welcome. She was orchestrating something. And Emily was done pretending it wasn't happening. The morning after the confrontation in the garden, Emily sat at the kitchen table in silence, stirring a cup of coffee she had no intention of drinking. The air between her and Ryan was colder than the brew in her hand. Margaret hadn't come downstairs yet, but the echo of her presence lingered like a fog. No apology had been offered, and no boundaries had been restored. Emily knew then that neither of those things would come from Ryan. If change were to happen, it would have to come from her. She left the house mid-morning without telling anyone where she was going. Her steps took her through the crisp Denver streets, aimless at first, until she found herself standing in front of a cafe she hadn't been to in months. The bells above the door jingled softly as she walked in, and she saw Claire seated by the window, laptop open and a half-eaten muffin beside her. Claire had been Emily's colleague for years before transferring to a private school in Boulder. Their friendship had dulled under the weight of Emily's new marriage and obligations. But something about today pulled her back to this place and this person. Emily? Claire's voice was surprised but warm. Wow, it's been forever. Emily forced a small smile and slid into the seat across from her. I needed a familiar face. Claire studied her. You look like you haven't slept in weeks. I haven't. Claire closed her laptop. Talk to me? For the next 30 minutes, Emily spoke without stopping. She told Claire everything. The silent assumptions about the house, the gradual shift in power after the wedding, Margaret's calculated intrusions, Ryan's passivity, the missing journals. Her voice cracked only once. When describing the moment, she realized Ryan had left her alone in her own defense. Claire listened without interrupting, her expression growing tighter with each revelation. When Emily finally fell quiet, Claire leaned forward. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and it might make things worse before it gets better." Emily tensed. "What is it?" Claire took a breath. "Margaret knew Ryan was moving in with you before the wedding, right?" Emily nodded. She also knew where the house was, had seen it more than once. "That's not unusual. But do you remember Mia? My old roommate." Emily blinked. "Of course. Well, Mia works at the title office now. Margaret went there about 2 months before your wedding, asked about transferring property titles. She pretended to be acting on Ryan's behalf, said they were combining assets, and she wanted to know what paperwork would be involved if Ryan wanted to add his name to the deed of house that they would be living in together." Emily's stomach dropped. "What?" Claire nodded grimly. Mia didn't process anything for her. She said it was just an inquiry, but the way Margaret phrased everything, she was under the impression the house already belonged to Ryan. She never once used your name. Emily sat back in the chair, her pulse pounding. So she thought the house was his. She did. And when she found out otherwise, well, I'm guessing that was after she moved in and started getting too comfortable. A slow, burning realization settled in Emily's chest. Margaret had never been confused. She had been operating under a delusion, one that she clearly hadn't created alone. Ryan must have told her it was his, Emily murmured, or at least never corrected her. Claire looked pained. "I'm sorry, Em. I didn't know how to bring it up earlier." Emily shook her head. "No, I'm glad you did." She walked home slowly, the world sharper around her edges. Margaret's behavior was no longer mysterious. It was strategic. She had walked into what she believed was her son's home and acted accordingly. Every overreach, every suggestion, every change, it all made sense now. And worst of all, Ryan had allowed the lie to fester. That night, Emily didn't speak to either of them. Margaret made a chicken casserole and left a plate out for her with a sticky note that read, "Dinner's ready," in bright ink. Emily ignored it and went upstairs. She needed clarity, and she needed to act. The next morning, she called in sick to work and drove downtown. Her first stop was a legal consultation. She met with a property attorney, a woman named Laura with sharp eyes and an even sharper tone. After hearing the story, Laura nodded. "Legally, the house is yours. You're the sole owner on record. If anyone is living there without a lease or agreement, they can be asked to leave. If they refuse, there are steps we can take." Emily hesitated. "What if one of them is my husband?" Laura leaned forward. "If he's not on the deed and there's no cohabitation agreement giving him rights to the property, he's living there at your discretion. It's uncommon, but not unheard of, especially in cases where property was acquired before the marriage." Emily left with a folder of documents and a growing sense of empowerment. She wasn't powerless. She had simply been afraid to use the power she already possessed. Back at home, she didn't say anything immediately. She bided her time, observed. Margaret continued her reign with smug confidence, offering unsolicited suggestions for a kitchen remodel, commenting on the ugly old tiles in the foyer, and asking when they'd start house hunting for something more modern. That evening, as they all sat in the living room, Margaret with her tablet, Ryan pretending to read the news, Emily flipping through a blank notebook, Margaret spoke casually. "You know, I've been thinking. This house is lovely, but it's not ideal for a growing family. If you two ever plan to have children, you'll need more space, a better layout, maybe something closer to the school district Ryan's been eyeing." Emily closed her notebook. "You think we should move?" Margaret didn't look up. "Eventually, yes. A new house. In Ryan's name, of course. Clean slate. A real investment." Ryan nodded slowly. "I mean, if we sold this place, we could use the equity for something bigger." Emily smiled faintly. "You're right. We should think about that." Margaret's eyes lit up, mistaking Emily's compliance for submission. "Wonderful. I can start looking at listings. Maybe call a realtor friend of mine. She's excellent with family homes. Emily's smile widened. That sounds perfect. She stood, walked upstairs, and returned a moment later with a manila envelope. Neither of them noticed at first. She sat on the couch across from them and placed the envelope on the table. "What's that?" Ryan asked. Emily looked at him. "Just a little reminder of who owns this house." Margaret blinked. "What are you talking about?" Emily opened the envelope, removed the deed, and spread the document flat on the coffee table. Her name, printed in bold letters, stood out like a shout. She slid it toward them. "Before we go any further with this family investment, I thought you should both see who actually holds the title." The silence that followed was almost theatrical. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes scanning the page, her face slowly draining of color. Ryan stared, then looked up at Emily. "You never told me." "No," Emily said. "I didn't." Margaret's voice was brittle. "This house is in your name only?" "It always has been," Emily replied, "since years before I met either of you." The air in the room was suddenly sharp, like a wire stretched to the point of breaking. Emily waited for someone to speak, to protest, to lie, but there was only silence. And Emily, sitting calmly in the center of it, finally felt the ground beneath her solidify. The silence that settled after Emily presented the deed wasn't broken immediately. Margaret didn't lash out, nor did Ryan jump to his feet in defense. Instead, they both sat quietly, their faces unreadable. Margaret's eyes flicked from the paper to Emily, and then back again, her mouth pressed into a tight line. Ryan's shoulders slumped slightly, like a man who had just remembered a fact he'd tried hard to forget. Emily didn't expect gratitude, but the absence of denial was, for now, enough. The next few days unfolded in a curious new rhythm. Margaret kept her distance, no longer offering unsolicited advice about the house or suggesting changes to decor. Her dominance of the common spaces receded slightly, though the tension remained palpable. Ryan, for his part, became unusually attentive, making coffee in the morning before Emily came downstairs, folding laundry she hadn't asked him to, even suggesting they go out for dinner, just the two of us. Emily wasn't fooled by the sudden shift. His kindness felt like penance without confession. On Thursday morning, while Emily was getting ready for work, Margaret knocked on her bedroom door, something she had never bothered to do before. "I'd like to speak with you privately," she said, "if you're willing." Emily, still in a robe, stared at her for a moment before nodding once. She followed Margaret downstairs into the kitchen, where a pot of coffee was already brewing and 2 mugs were set on the counter. Margaret didn't waste time. "I'd like to propose something." Emily remained standing. "I'm listening." Margaret sat and folded her hands neatly. "You've made it clear the house is yours. I understand that now. I may not agree with how you handled it, but I acknowledge the fact." Emily crossed her arms, wary. Margaret continued, "I also recognize that the current arrangement, me living here indefinitely, is not ideal for any of us. So I've been thinking of a solution, one that benefits all parties." Emily tilted her head, slightly silent. "I propose we sell this house," Margaret said. "Use the proceeds to buy a new one, a larger, more modern space, something better suited for your future as a family. The new property would be in Ryan's name. A clean start, no secrets, no questions, just a home shared equally between husband and wife." Emily didn't speak at first. She let the silence stretch just long enough to make Margaret uncomfortable. "And you?" she asked finally. "What would your role be in this new arrangement?" Margaret hesitated, but not for long. "I would help facilitate the transition. Perhaps move with you temporarily until I found my own place nearby. But the important thing is ensuring that Ryan has ownership, that he feels secure, that you both feel secure." Emily leaned forward slightly. "So your solution to this awkward living situation is for me to sell the home I bought with my own money, hand over the value to my husband, and start over under his name?" "It's about unity," Margaret said quickly. "About fairness." Emily studied her. "This isn't about fairness. This is about control. You assumed the house was his. You treated me like a guest in my own home. And now that the truth is out, you want to shift the power again. Margaret's smile tightened. I'm trying to protect my son's future. Your son's future is not in danger, Emily said, but his marriage might be. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but stopped herself. For a moment, the mask slipped again. Behind the polished words and careful expressions, Emily saw something raw and panicked. Margaret hadn't expected to lose footing so quickly. Emily straightened. The answer is no. I'm not selling this house. And I'm certainly not putting it in anyone else's name. Margaret's lips parted as if to argue, but Emily raised a hand. We're done here. She walked out of the kitchen without another word. Upstairs, she paused in the hallway, heart racing. The conversation had confirmed what she suspected all along. Margaret wasn't improvising. This was a strategy, a calculated attempt to reshape the household dynamic to her preference, to make Ryan the perceived provider, to diminish Emily's authority under the guise of marital equality. But she hadn't expected Emily to push back, and that gave Emily an idea. That weekend, Emily invited 2 friends over for brunch, people Margaret had never met and who didn't know the tension simmering beneath the surface of the house. Emily didn't mention her guests until they arrived, walking in with a bottle of orange juice and a bag of bagels. Margaret appeared in the hallway, just as Emily was pouring mimosas. "Oh," she said, startled. "I didn't realize we were having company." Emily smiled. "I figured we could use some fresh energy in the house." The morning passed with laughter, stories, and casual discussion about real estate. Emily made sure to say, loud enough for Margaret to hear, "This house is my favorite place in the world. Took me 7 years to save up for it. Worth every sacrifice." Margaret never sat down. She lingered in the background, then retreated upstairs. Emily never mentioned her once. When the guests left, she passed by Margaret's room and spoke loud enough through the door. "Thanks for staying out of the way today." It meant a lot. The next few days were quiet, tense. Margaret's movements became more measured. She didn't speak of realtors again. She didn't touch the thermostat. The refrigerator was no longer reorganized overnight. Emily knew it wouldn't last. On Wednesday night, Ryan came into their bedroom while Emily was reading. "She meant well," he said without prompting. Emily didn't lower the book. Did she? "She's just trying to make things right. By asking me to give up my house?" Ryan sat at the edge of the bed. She thought it would bring balance. "She thinks I should be equal in the marriage." Emily finally looked at him. "Do you think you're not?" He hesitated. "I don't know. It's complicated." "No, it's not," she said. "You're married to me, not to her. And this isn't about a house. It's about trust. The fact that I protected myself is not the problem. The problem is that I had to." Ryan didn't respond. Emily leaned closer. "She's waiting for me to slip, for me to make a mistake. But I won't. And I won't be bullied into surrendering what I worked for." Ryan stood slowly. "She's not staying forever. I'll talk to her again." Emily nodded, but something in her had already shifted. She no longer expected resolution from Ryan. Not truly. She understood now that Margaret's presence wasn't just a disruption. It was a mirror. It revealed the fractures already present in her marriage. The imbalance, the silence, the avoidance. And if Margaret was testing the foundation of Emily's world, she would soon learn that Emily had already started laying the groundwork for something stronger without them. By the following Monday, Emily had moved beyond confrontation and into preparation. No more debates. No more emotional appeals. Margaret's manipulations were no longer surprising. They were predictable. And Ryan's silence was no longer painful. It was expected. What Emily hadn't expected was how quickly her own resolve had sharpened. She began her mornings earlier, long before Margaret stirred. While the house was quiet and the coffee brewed, she sat at the kitchen table reviewing legal documents and carefully compiling everything she might need. Her conversations with the property attorney had left her with a clear understanding of her rights, and now she began collecting tangible proof. Utility bills in her name, tax receipts from previous years, home improvement invoices, and every bank transfer linked to her mortgage payments. She printed and organized everything meticulously, labeling each folder with the precision of someone who had been underestimated one too many times. During the afternoons, she quietly recorded events as they happened, not with anger but with precision. The time Margaret replaced their shower curtain without asking, the day she signed for a delivery and installed a new ceiling fan in the dining room, the moments Ryan made passing remarks about our place in front of guests when he still refused to acknowledge the truth out loud. Emily wrote them all down in a leather-bound journal, not for vengeance, but for clarity. She needed to see, written plainly, how far the imbalance had gone. One evening, after a particularly strained dinner, she went into the garage, opened a plastic storage bin labeled winter decor, and pulled out a small fireproof safe. It was old, purchased during her early days as a homeowner, when she was obsessed with preparedness. She placed inside it copies of the deed, her compiled records, and her new legal folder marked property and rights. She slid the safe under her bed, hidden but easily reachable. Her next step was more delicate. She called Laura, the attorney, and scheduled a second consultation, not at the office this time, but at a small, quiet coffee house across town. They sat in a back corner booth, away from curious eyes and nosy ears. "This isn't about eviction yet," Emily said, hands wrapped around her cup. "But I need to be ready if it comes to that." Laura nodded. "Good. The earlier we act, the cleaner the process. Has there been any aggression? Threats?" "Not overtly, but she's calculated. And I wouldn't put manipulation past her." Laura reached into her bag and handed Emily a template. "This is a notice to vacate. It's not a legal eviction order, but it's the first step. You'd give this directly to her, with a copy to your husband. It's formal, documented. It shows intent to regain control of your home." Emily stared at the document. "And if she refuses, then we file a forcible entry and detain her action through the court. It won't be pleasant, but it's your legal right. Just remember, if it comes to that, don't get emotional. Let the document speak." Emily nodded slowly. "I understand." When she returned home that afternoon, she passed Margaret in the hallway, who was rearranging the framed photographs in the upstairs corridor. "These ones should be closer to eye level," Margaret said without looking at her. "It's more welcoming for guests." Emily didn't reply. She walked into her bedroom, closed the door, and sat on the bed with the notice in her hand. The paper was smooth and personal, but it pulsed with power. She wasn't ready to deliver it yet, but soon, very soon, that weekend, while Ryan was out running errands, Margaret cornered Emily in the kitchen. She was holding a glossy brochure from a real estate agency. "I spoke to a lovely agent this week," she said casually. "She says the market is perfect right now for a sale. We could get a great return if we list soon. And she has a few stunning 4-bedroom properties already lined up." Emily didn't answer. Margaret took the silence as invitation. She mentioned we'd need to stage the house, of course. Declutter a bit. Maybe repaint the walls neutral tones. "I'd be happy to take charge of that process, if you're feeling overwhelmed." Emily folded her arms. "You're planning to sell my house?" Margaret's smile didn't waver. "I'm planning to help the family move forward. That's what you want, isn't it?" Emily walked over to the drawer by the fridge, pulled out a pen, and wrote something on a sticky note. She handed it to Margaret. It read, "Consult your assumptions before making plans." Margaret stared at it, her lips twitching, cryptic. Emily turned her back and began chopping vegetables, the conversation over. Later that night, after Ryan returned, Emily asked him to sit with her on the back patio. The sky was soft and gray, the porch light casting long shadows across the floorboards. She handed him a folder, smaller than the others, but still thick with evidence. "These are the documents of the house," she said. "Everything you've never asked to see." Ryan flipped through them, pausing on the tax forms, the water bills, the title deed. "I don't understand," he said. "Why are you showing me this now?" "Because it's time you face the truth," Emily replied. "You've let your mother run this house like it's hers. You've treated me like I was wrong for defending it. I need you to see what I built and what I'm not going to lose." Ryan closed the folder and looked up at her. "I never meant to hurt you." "But you did," she said. "Not by accident." By omission, you allowed this to happen. You let her believe a lie. And when I tried to set things right, you disappeared into silence. What do you want me to do now? He asked quietly. Emily didn't answer right away. She looked out over the yard, the trees swaying softly. I want you to choose, she said, because soon I'll be choosing for myself. As the days passed, Margaret grew increasingly restless. Her voice was sharper during dinner, her commentary more frequent. One morning, she moved Emily's work materials from the dining room table and replaced them with fabric samples and paint swatches. I've been thinking of giving the space a fresh look, she announced. The natural light is perfect for a sage green theme, very calming. Emily looked at her for a long moment. Then she walked upstairs, opened her desk drawer, and pulled out the envelope that held the notice to vacate. She returned to the dining room, unfolded the document, and placed it in front of Margaret on the freshly arranged fabric samples. What's this? Margaret asked, frowning. It's a formal request, Emily said. You have 30 days to find somewhere else to live. Margaret's mouth opened, then closed. She stared at the paper, blinking as though reading it would make it disappear. You can't be serious. I am. This is my son's home. Emily shook her head. No, it isn't. And if he wants to be part of my life, he'll accept that. If not, he's free to go with you. Margaret stood, flustered, her voice louder now. You're humiliating me. I'm setting a boundary, one that should have been clear from the start. She turned and walked away, not needing to see Margaret's reaction. Her hands trembled slightly, but her spine remained straight. This wasn't revenge. This was reclaiming her space. Margaret's reaction to the formal notice was swift and aggressive, but never overtly hostile. Instead, she transformed overnight into a quiet force of persistence, carefully orchestrating her next moves with precision that unsettled Emily. It was clear that Margaret didn't intend to leave without a fight, and Emily knew the battle had only just begun. One afternoon, Emily returned home early from school to find a man standing in the living room. He was tall, middle-aged, wearing a navy blazer and carrying a leather briefcase. His polished shoes clicked softly against the hardwood floor as he extended a hand. Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm David Walters, a real estate broker with Evergreen Realty, he said with a practiced smile. Mrs. Preston contacted me last week about listing your property. Emily blinked. Listing my property? David nodded. Yes. She mentioned that you were amenable to a sale and that you were considering moving to a larger home as part of your new family plans. Emily felt a rush of disbelief. I haven't authorized anyone to sell this house. David glanced at a folder he held, flipping it open to a sheet that displayed Emily's signature. This document was signed on your behalf, ma'am. A power of attorney giving Mrs. Preston authority to handle the sale. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she took the folder. She scanned the paper and immediately recognized the forgery. The signature was close, but the flow was off, too mechanical, like someone had traced her name without her knowledge. I never signed this, Emily said firmly, meeting David's eyes. This is fraudulent. David's smile faltered, but only for a moment. Mrs. Preston insists that she has your best interests at heart, and that this is merely to expedite the process. Emily's voice rose. I will not allow this. This house belongs to me, legally and emotionally. You will leave immediately. David nodded quickly, backing toward the door. Of course, ma'am. If you change your mind, here's my card. He exited, leaving Emily stunned but resolute. The audacity of Margaret's attempt was staggering, but confirmed what Emily already suspected. Her mother-in-law was willing to cross any line. That evening, Emily called Ryan. The phone rang twice before he answered, his voice low and cautious. We need to talk, she said immediately, about what just happened. There was a pause on the other end. What happened? Margaret hired a realtor and forged my signature to sell the house. Ryan's breath hitched. I didn't know. I swear. Emily closed her eyes, holding back frustration. You always say that, but I'm done believing it. You need to choose who you're with, me or her. I'm caught in the middle, Ryan said weakly. You made this your problem. Now it's time to fix it. The next day, Emily met with Laura again. Together, they drafted a cease and desist letter, demanding Margaret immediately withdraw all sales actions and relinquish any claimed authority over property. The letter was sent via certified mail, ensuring proof of delivery. While waiting for a response, Emily continued documenting every interaction. Margaret grew more guarded, her previous confidence fading into caution, but her presence was still suffocating, her eyes watching every move Emily made. One night, Emily awoke to the sound of muffled voices in the kitchen, quiet but unmistakable. She crept downstairs and peered into the living room through the half-open door. Margaret and Ryan were seated close, whispering urgently. She overheard fragments. Not worth losing him. Need to find common ground. Maybe if we agree to sell... Emily's heart sank. Margaret was manipulating Ryan, weaving a narrative that painted Emily as unreasonable. But this time, Emily wasn't passive. She cleared her throat, stepping into the room. Both startled, Ryan looked away. Margaret's smile faltered. "Can I join the conversation?" Emily said calmly. Ryan sighed. "Emily, it's complicated." "No, it isn't," Emily said firmly. "This is about trust, about respect. You need to decide if you want to protect your marriage or your mother's agenda." Margaret frowned. "I'm only trying to help." "By trying to take what's mine?" Emily asked. "By forging my signature?" The room fell silent. Ryan's eyes met hers, uncertain. Margaret's defenses crumbled into a mixture of anger and disbelief. Emily pressed on. "This house isn't up for negotiation, and I won't be pushed out." Ryan swallowed hard. I need time to think." Emily nodded. "You have until then." As she returned upstairs, Emily felt the weight of what was to come. The battle lines were clear. Margaret wasn't just an overbearing mother-in-law. She was a calculated adversary, and Ryan stood at a crossroads. Emily understood she couldn't rely on his indecision any longer. If she wanted to protect what was hers, she'd have to be ready to fight harder than ever before. The days that followed the confrontation with the realtor were filled with an eerie silence in the house. Margaret retreated into a cold quietness, her usual intrusive chatter replaced by sharp glances and tight-lipped smiles. Emily could feel the tension in every corner, like a storm holding its breath. The battle was no longer one of words, but of wills, silent, potent, and escalating beneath the surface. Emily had anticipated that Margaret might lash out, but instead, the older woman seemed to shrink, as if weighing her options, preparing her next move carefully. But Emily was no longer afraid to face whatever came. If Margaret thought silence meant surrender, she was sorely mistaken. One morning, Emily awoke to the faintest creak of footsteps downstairs. She slipped out of bed and quietly descended to the kitchen, where she found an envelope resting on the counter. It was unmarked, its paper thick and expensive to touch. She opened it cautiously. Inside was a letter, typewritten and cold in tone. "Dear Ms. Clark, this is a formal notice that your continued occupation of the property located at 1425 Elm Street constitutes a trespass. You are hereby required to vacate the premises within 15 days of receipt of this letter. Failure to comply will result in immediate legal action. Respectfully, Margaret Preston." Emily's eyes narrowed. It was a clear attempt to intimidate, a bluff wrapped in legalese, but lacking any real authority. It was a first strike in a war of documents, threats, and power plays she now fully understood she was entrenched in. She immediately took the letter to Laura, the property attorney. Laura's expression darkened as she read it. "This is illegal," she said bluntly. "She can't demand you leave a house you own. This is harassment. We'll respond firmly." They drafted a response underscoring Emily's legal rights and reminding Margaret that any further attempts to intimidate or harass would be met with legal consequences. Emily made sure to keep copies of every letter and email exchange, filing everything meticulously. Meanwhile, the atmosphere at home remained tense. Ryan drifted between the two women, increasingly uncomfortable but unwilling or unable to step decisively. Emily caught him several times avoiding her gaze, retreating to his phone or his headphones when she tried to engage him. One afternoon, Emily found Ryan in the garage, packing a box of old photographs and keepsakes. His face was flushed, conflicted. "Ryan," she said softly, "what are you doing?" He looked up, startled. "Just packing some things for Mom." She asked if I could help. Emily's stomach clenched. "Why?" He shrugged. She said she might move out soon. Give everyone some space. Emily didn't know whether to be relieved or suspicious. That evening, Margaret sat at the dining table, flipping through a catalog for home security systems. "I thought it might be nice to install cameras," she said, her voice light but firm. "For protection, for the house, for all of us." Emily held her breath. "Where would these cameras be?" "Oh, just the main entrances," Margaret replied. "Nothing intrusive, just peace of mind." Ryan nodded slowly. "It's not a bad idea." Emily's eyes narrowed. "I don't want cameras in my home." Margaret's smile was tight. "You're not the only one who lives here." Emily knew better than to argue further. She excused herself and went upstairs, heart pounding. This wasn't about security. It was about surveillance, control. Days later, Emily began installing her own security measures, changing locks, setting up alarms, and placing her own cameras. She shared the footage only with Laura, ensuring an impartial witness to any future incidents. In the meantime, Margaret grew quieter still. She stopped rearranging furniture or imposing her routines. Instead, she focused on small passive-aggressive actions, moving Emily's mail, leaving laundry unfolded, turning down the heat overnight, and speaking softly to Ryan about the stress of family disputes. Emily responded with calm determination. She maintained her routines, continued documenting every incident, and guarded her boundaries firmly. One afternoon, Emily returned home to find a note slipped under the front door. "You're making this difficult for everyone. Think about what's at stake." No signature, no address. Emily showed the note to Laura, who called it harassment, and encouraged Emily to report it to the police. Emily hesitated, but ultimately filed a report, providing copies of all prior correspondence and incidents. The police promised to keep an eye on the situation, though they cautioned that without direct threats, their options were limited. Despite the mounting pressure, Emily refused to be cowed. She spent evenings in her study, drafting letters and researching tenants' rights. She even began looking into filing for an injunction against Margaret if necessary. Ryan remained distant, caught in the crossfire. One night, Emily confronted him after a particularly cold dinner. "Ryan, you can't keep pretending this isn't happening. I'm fighting for us, for this marriage, but you have to be here with me." He looked down, voice barely a whisper. "I'm scared, Emily. I don't want to lose my mom, but I don't want to lose you either." She reached for his hand. "Then choose, because right now, it feels like you've chosen neither." Ryan nodded slowly, tears glistening in his eyes. "I need to figure this out." Emily squeezed his hand, knowing the road ahead would be difficult. But at least now, the lines were drawn clearly. The silent counterattack had begun, and she would meet it with strength, resilience, and unwavering resolve. The tension in the house had been mounting like a tightly coiled spring ready to snap. Every room seemed charged with unsaid words and simmering frustrations. Emily had taken every precaution, gathered every legal document, installed every security device she could muster. Still, the looming question remained. How long could this fragile peace hold before everything shattered? One evening, after a long day at school, Emily arrived home to find the living room unusually silent. No hum of the television, no clatter of dishes from the kitchen. She called out softly, "Ryan? Margaret?" No answer. Unease crept into her chest as she stepped further into the room. Her eyes immediately landed on Margaret, seated stiffly in the armchair, face pale and eyes cold. Ryan stood nearby, his posture tense, fingers twitching nervously. Neither spoke at first. Margaret's lips curled into a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Emily," she said, voice sharp and clipped, "I believe it's time we had an honest conversation." Emily folded her arms, standing tall despite the surge of adrenaline. "I agree." Margaret took a breath, as if steeling herself. "You have made it clear that you intend to assert control over this house, that you have no intention of yielding." Emily nodded. Because it's my home, something I worked hard to own. Margaret's eyes flicked to Ryan, who shifted uncomfortably. And yet, here you stand, unwilling to compromise, unwilling to listen. It is no longer about the house. It is about respect, about family. Emily's voice was steady but fierce. Respect isn't demanded by intrusion or manipulation. It's earned. You have disrespected me repeatedly, through your actions, your assumptions, and your refusal to acknowledge my rights. Margaret's jaw tightened. You humiliate me by not recognizing my role. You deceive your husband, withholding truths that affect us all. You turn this family against me. Ryan spoke up, voice shaky. Mom, please, let's not do this here. No, Margaret snapped. This is where it ends. If I am to leave, I demand conditions. Emily raised an eyebrow. Conditions? Margaret's eyes glinted with cold determination. You will allow Ryan to remain in the house, with me. He will have equal say in the property. You will not threaten our family with legal action. Emily's laughter was low and bitter. You mean, you want to give up everything I own, so you and Ryan can stay here and continue to undermine me? Margaret nodded. It is fair. He is your husband. Ryan's face crumpled, caught between two fiercely determined women. Emily stepped closer, lowering her voice. No, I will not surrender my home, and I will not allow either of you to treat me as less than a partner in this marriage. Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping the hardwood floor. Then you leave me no choice. Emily tensed, prepared for an outburst. Margaret's voice dropped to a harsh whisper. You think you're strong now? Wait until the community knows your secrets, your lies. I will make sure everyone sees the truth. You will be isolated, alone. Ryan's eyes widened, fear flickering in them. Emily's gaze hardened. If that is your plan, be prepared to face me in court, in public, and beyond. I am not afraid. Margaret smiled thinly. We shall see. With that, she swept past Emily and Ryan, storming out the front door. Ryan closed his eyes, running a hand through his hair. I'm sorry. Emily shook her head. Sorry isn't enough anymore. The following days were a whirlwind. Margaret began reaching out to neighbors and acquaintances, planting stories that painted Emily as deceitful and controlling. Anonymous notes appeared in the mailbox. Rumors spread subtly through social circles. Emily bore it all with quiet dignity, refusing to engage in the smear campaign. Meanwhile, Ryan remained distant, caught in his own turmoil. One evening, Emily found him packing a small suitcase. I'm going with Mom for a while, he said quietly, to give us all some space. Emily's heart clenched, but she nodded. If you need to find clarity, then go, but know where I stand. Ryan hugged her briefly and left. The house felt emptier than before, but Emily no longer felt alone. She was reclaiming her life, her space, and her dignity. The final confrontation had set the terms, and while the battle was far from over, Emily was ready to face whatever came next, stronger and more determined than ever. The house was quieter than it had ever been since Emily had moved in. The absence of Ryan and Margaret was a hollow echo that reverberated through every room, every corner. Though the physical space was hers alone now, the emotional landscape was still fraught with memories, tensions, and unresolved questions. Days stretched into weeks, and Emily focused on rebuilding her life piece by piece. The garden she had once lovingly tended began to flourish again under her careful hands, and the quiet evenings gave her time to reflect on who she was beyond the tangled mess of marriage and family conflict. But amid the calm, Emily knew the story was far from over. One late afternoon, just as the sun began to dip behind the Rocky Mountains, Emily heard the unmistakable sound of the front door opening. Her heart quickened. She wasn't expecting anyone. She walked into the foyer and saw Ryan standing there, a small bag slung over his shoulder, his expression weary and uncertain. Margaret was nowhere in sight. Emily, he said quietly. She nodded, motioning for him to sit in the living room. The familiar creak of the couch felt strange, as if it belonged to a different time. I needed to come back, Ryan began, his voice heavy. I thought time apart would help me figure things out. Emily listened carefully, waiting for him to continue. I realized that I was hiding behind my mother's shadow, afraid to confront the truth. I thought staying with her was the right thing, but it only made everything worse. For you, for us. Emily's eyes searched his face for sincerity. I'm sorry for not standing by you, he said, for letting her control things, for not defending you when you needed me most. She swallowed the lump in her throat. Why now, Ryan? Why come back after all this? He looked down. Because I don't want to lose you. Not like this. The silence stretched between them. Finally, Emily spoke. Ryan, I don't know if we can pick up where we left off. Trust was broken, by you and by her. But I'm willing to try if you're willing to change. Ryan reached out, taking her hand gently. I want to be better. For you, for us. For a moment, hope flickered in Emily's chest. But the shadow of Margaret's presence still loomed. I need you to understand something, Emily said firmly. This house is mine. It's more than just property. It's my hard work, my sanctuary. If you want to be part of my life, you have to respect that. Ryan nodded slowly. I understand. They talked late into the night, peeling back layers of fear, resentment, and misunderstanding. It wasn't easy, and it wouldn't be instant, but for the first time in months, they were speaking honestly. Yet, Emily knew the real test was yet to come. Margaret's influence was powerful, and Ryan's loyalty was still fragile. He would have to make a choice, not just between his mother and his wife, but between the past and the future. The next morning, Emily received a text from Ryan. Mom and I talked. She's moving out. I'm staying here with you. Relief and cautious optimism mingled within her. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, she felt she wasn't walking alone. In the weeks that followed, Margaret's departure was slow but definitive. She packed her things without argument, the air between her and Emily cold but civil. Ryan helped where he could, a silent apology in his steady presence. Emily watched the space transform back into her home, one free of intrusion, one where her voice carried weight again. As she closed the door behind Margaret on her last day, Emily took a deep breath. This was her house, her life, and now, her choice. For better or worse, the foundation was laid, and she was ready to build anew. In the weeks following Margaret's departure and Ryan's return to home, Emily found herself in a strange new world, one where quiet reigns not from absence of conflict, but from reclaimed peace. The house, once crowded with tension, slowly transformed back into a sanctuary, her sanctuary. Each morning, Emily woke to soft sunlight filtering through the sheer curtains in the bedroom she had always considered hers, untouched by intrusion. The small kitchen smelled faintly of fresh coffee, and she would often find Ryan already there, quietly making breakfast, the tension between them easing with each shared meal. But the process of rebuilding was neither swift nor simple. There were days when the ghosts of past arguments whispered in the corners, when Emily caught herself flinching at a raised voice or feeling the weight of loneliness despite Ryan's presence. But these moments were fleeting, because she had decided that this time she would not lose herself to appeasement. Slowly, Emily started revisiting parts of herself she had set aside. The bookshelves, once half disheveled from Margaret's reign, were reorganized according to Emily's personal touch. Novels grouped by themes, poetry collections front and center, cherished first editions carefully dusted. The garden bloomed again under her patient hands. She planted lavender and daisies, the fragrances weaving through open windows, reminding her of freedom and growth. She reconnected with old friends, inviting them over for long conversations and dinners filled with laughter rather than strained silences. At work, she threw herself into her student successes, finding joy in teaching literature, in words and stories that reminded her of resilience and hope. Ryan, too, began to shift. The once tentative man who had vacillated under his mother's influence now stood more firmly beside Emily. They attended counseling together, breaking patterns of silence and avoidance. Through honest conversations and shared vulnerability, they navigated the tangled emotions left in the wake of Margaret's presence. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars, Ryan reached for Emily's hand. I never want to take your strength for granted again, he said softly. You showed me what it means to stand up, to protect what's ours. I'm grateful. Emily smiled, squeezing his hand gently. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary for both of us. The house became a reflection of their renewed partnership, a place where decisions were made together, boundaries respected, and love rebuilt on trust rather than assumptions. Margaret's absence was felt, but no longer as a source of pain or fear. Instead, it was a quiet reminder of the lessons learned, of vigilance, courage, and the power of self-respect. Emily understood now that peace wasn't simply the absence of conflict. It was a presence of respect, honesty, and the freedom to be oneself. As the months passed, the house truly became home. A place where Emily could be whole, no longer guarded, no longer silenced, but free to grow. And in that freedom, she found not only peace, but a renewed hope for the future. Months had passed since the storm had finally passed through Emily's life. The house, one of the battleground of control and secrets, now felt warm and inviting. A true home shaped by Emily's steady hands and resolute heart. Though the scars of the past still whispered quietly in her mind, they no longer defined her or the life she was determined to build. Emily had grown in ways she hadn't expected. The struggle to protect her home and herself had carved out a new sense of strength and clarity. The independence she had always cherished was no longer just about property or possessions. It was about self-respect and the courage to set boundaries. She had learned that protecting her space was not selfishness. It was love for herself. Ryan, too, had changed. The man who once wavered under his mother's influence had begun to stand tall beside her, embracing his role not just as her husband, but as her partner. Together, they navigated the fragile but hopeful path of healing. Counseling sessions brought honesty and understanding to the surface, and slowly, the walls they had built around their relationship began to crumble. Yet, beneath the calm, Emily sensed something that could not be ignored. The foundation of their marriage had shifted irreparably. The presence of Margaret, the years of silence and avoidance, had altered the course of their lives. The love they had shared was not lost, but had changed shape, no longer the shelter it once promised to be. One late autumn afternoon, Emily sat at the kitchen table, sipping tea, the soft light casting golden hues through the window. Ryan entered quietly, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Emily," he began hesitantly, "I've been doing a lot of thinking." She looked up, heart quickening. "I realize that to truly move forward, I need to be honest with myself and with you. The past months have shown me things I tried to ignore. I want to be better, but maybe we want different things." Emily nodded slowly, understanding the weight of his words. "I think it's time we consider a new chapter. For both of us," Ryan continued, "separately if necessary, but with respect, with peace." Tears welled in Emily's eyes, not from sadness, but from the quiet relief of truth spoken. She reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "I've thought about this too," she admitted, "and I believe that sometimes love means knowing when to let go." They talked late into the evening, weaving through memories and hopes, fears and dreams. The decision was mutual yet bittersweet. A divorce, yes, but also a chance for rebirth, to reclaim their own lives on terms that honored who they truly were. In the days that followed, Emily began the legal process with a clear mind and steady heart. She felt no bitterness, only gratitude for the lessons learned and the strength gained. The house remained hers, the sanctuary she had fought so fiercely to protect. As she packed the last box, preparing to turn the page, Emily stood by the front door, looking out at the garden bursting with late-blooming flowers. The house, her house, was filled with the echoes of the past and the promise of the future. She smiled softly to herself, knowing she had made the right choice. Protecting her space was an act of love, for herself and for the life she was ready to embrace. The door closed gently behind her, and with that, Emily stepped forward into a new beginning, stronger, wiser, and free.